Well, it's good to be back, church. We've had a really blessed week in Keswick. Thank you for freeing us up to go and for praying for us as well. And we are back in Leviticus because the job is this, to finish Leviticus before our babies arrive. So this morning, however, it's not a chore to open a book of Leviticus, but I hope you'll find it something joyful because the topic is just splendid. And we're going to have a little picture up on the screen this morning, which will introduce it. But if I asked you, have you ever had money troubles, financial difficulty, what would you say? If you're a human being, you'd probably say yes. And it's not just individuals that have money trouble, is it? Whole nations have trouble with money. We know our councils are struggling with budgets, aren't we? We should pray for them. Do you know what the UK national debt is currently sat at? Yeah. So currently it's about £2.7 trillion of national debt. And our debt is close to our GDP. It's nearly 100% of GDP. So money troubles, we're familiar with it in the world. Now, different economists have thought about how to tackle it. Different people of philosophy have thought about how to deal with it. And, we have a whole spectrum of ideas, don't we? We have those who are on a sort of more of a communism side, those who are in favor of capitalism. And I wonder if you heard of the idea of the Great Reset. Did you hear about that? So it became prominent during the time of COVID, and it was put forward by the World Economic Forum. Of a way of kind of resetting the economy. It was published, it came from a man's book a few years before, and it was met with different ideas, which we won't go into now, but there's this idea that our economy is broken. In fact, it's not just our economy that's broken, is it? Society is broken. Now, this morning, I want you to put on your imaginations. When was the last time you used your imagination? For some of us, it was a long time ago. But we're going to enter into it this morning. So here we go. Are you ready? I want you to imagine that you are an ancient Israelite. You know a bit about them. You've read the Bible. But you're a farmer. You work your family's land. And you earn enough to get by each week. You can put a little bit of savings aside. You're doing okay. You and your family work the land each year. You bring in the harvest of grain. You bring in the fruit. You maybe have a little bit of livestock, and things are okay. It's a simple life. It's early starts. It's hard work, but it's rewarding. And then, along the way, you made a bad investment. Perhaps you bought an animal that died, and so that set you back. Somebody in the family who was a wage earner, somebody who could work the land, died. And then you had perhaps a year or two of crop failures, and things got tighter and tighter and tighter until you couldn't provide for yourself or your children. And what can you do? Well, the only possession you had is your land, and you've had to sell it. That was the only way that you could make money, but you've had to sell it. That land that's been in your family for years and years and years is gone. How do you feel? You feel isolated and lost. How can you ever get back to where you were before? Wouldn't you long to turn back the clock? You'd long for a reset. If only something could be done. If only you could have a start over. What we're going to think about this morning in the scripture is one of the most radical agricultural, economic, and social ideas in the Bible. And it's called the year of Jubilee. We find it in Leviticus chapter 25. So I would encourage you to have your Bibles open. It's a long chapter. We won't go into every single verse, but it's helpful to read it. So Leviticus chapter 25, which is page 103 in our church Bibles. And we're going to see the mercy of God for his people, Israel. And we're also going to see how this idea of Jubilee makes a difference today. So we're going to split it into two parts, really, thinking about why God gave this command, what it was, and why it was important for his people. And we're also going to look at it in the light of Jesus this morning. So we're going to read from verses 1 to 11 of Leviticus 25, which says this: "The Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, saying, 'Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land that I give you, the land shall keep a Sabbath to the Lord. For 6 years you shall sow your field, and for 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather in its fruits. But in the 7th year there shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land, a Sabbath to the Lord. You shall not sow your field or prune your vineyard. You shall not reap what grows of itself in your harvest, or gather the grapes of your undressed vine. It shall be a year of solemn rest for the land. The Sabbath of the land, that is the Sabbath produce of the land, will provide food for you, for yourself and for your male and female slaves, and for your hired worker and the sojourner who lives with you, and for your cattle and for the wild animals that are in the land. All its yield shall be for food.'" And we're going to just hit pause there before we go on. The week is made up of how many days? 7. Too slow, 7. The Jewish calendar was made up of 7, wasn't it? And it wasn't just days, but it rolled into months. Remember, a lot of their festivals were in the 7th month. But here we've read that every 7 years, there was to be not a day of rest like in the week, Shabbat in the week, but there was to be a year of rest. You'd count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years, working your land, sowing, reaping, looking after the animals. And on the 7th year, you wouldn't do any of that work. There would be rest for the land. One of the problems in agriculture is that we don't give rest to the land. That's why farmers have to spend so much money on fertilizer artificially. Because if you keep taking from the land and taking from the land and taking from the land, there gets nothing left. And so you have to artificially add it in. God set up a way that if his people would follow it, would provide freshness to the land. And can I remind you what we thought about last time? God has given us that principle of 1 day of rest in 7 for freshness and vitality in your life too. This is the wisdom of God. So every 7 years there'd be rest. You wouldn't go to harvest formally. You'd just go and take what you needed that grew in the wild, and that would be enough for you, for your family, for the animals. Then verse 8 says this: "You shall count 7 weeks of years." So how many days in a week? 7. 7 weeks of years is how many years? 49. 7 squared, 7 times 7. So you shall count 49 years, 7 times 7 years. So at the time of the 7 weeks of years shall give you 49 years. And then you shall sound the loud trumpet on the 10th day of the 7th month. On the day of atonement, you shall sound the trumpet throughout all your land. And you shall consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you, when each of you shall return to his property, and each of you shall return to his clan. That 50th year shall be a jubilee for you. In it you shall neither sow nor reap what grows of itself, nor gather the grapes from the undressed vines, for it is a Jubilee. It shall be holy to you. You may eat the produce of the field. So every 7 years, there would be rest for the land. Time for the land to reset. Time for all the animals that are plowing every year to have a rest. Time for you and your family to rest. And then when you've gone through that cycle 7 times, you have an extra year on the end. The 50th year, which is called the year of Jubilee. It's called Jubilee because it comes from the word yovel, which means a horn or a trumpet. It's called that because they blow it. And we've got words like this, haven't we? In fact, we celebrated Jubilee not too long ago, the Queens. Jubilation, we have that word. And what does it bring to mind? It brings to mind joy, doesn't it? We have that Latin song, Jubilate Deo, which means, rejoice in the Lord. And you can see why this will be a time of joy. Because it would be a time of rest. And not only that, but did you see some of the stuff that would happen in this year? Well, they were to proclaim liberty. It says in verse 10, proclaim liberty to all the inhabitants of the land when you can return to your property and return to your clan. I want you to think of the most happy family reunion you've ever been to. Sometimes they're not happy, are they? Let's be honest. Sometimes they're a bit awkward. But those really happy times when everybody gets on, when that person that you really do love, or maybe friends, friends who you haven't seen for a long time, but you spend time with them, and it's just so refreshing and good. Well, part of that was included in the year of Jubilee. Think, as we did before, when we were imagining, you are that farmer who's come on difficult times, you've had to sell what's yours, and your land has been taken away. Well, what happens on that year of Jubilee? It's restored to you. Even if you can't pay what it's worth, it comes back into your family. What a gracious thing. And it's a time of rest, like we said. Now, if every 7 years people wouldn't go about and do their harvest, and then on the 50th year they'd do the same, that means on year 49 and year 50, there was no sowing and reaping formally. That would require faith, wouldn't it? Because you get your food from that. It would require faith. And let's read what it says in verses 18 to 22. You shall do my statutes and keep my rules and perform them, and then you will dwell in the land securely. The land will yield its fruit, and you will eat your fill and dwell in it securely. And if you say, well, what are we going to eat in the 7th year, and even in the Jubilee, if we may not sow or gather in our crop? And God says this, I will command my blessing on you in the 6th year, so that it will produce a crop sufficient for 3 years. When you sow in the 8th year, you'll be eating some of the old crop. You shall eat the old until the 9th year, when its crop arrives. It would require faith not to go about doing the sowing and the reaping, because you'd be thinking, where's my food going to come from? But that's the life of faith, isn't it, that we're called to live? Think about the manna that God sent to his people in the wilderness. They could gather on 6 days, but they couldn't go out on the Sabbath, could they? They had to trust that on day 6 they would have enough to cover them. And this is a principle through the Bible. The Lord calls us to things which may seem difficult, which may seem not to make sense. For example, and I know I mention this often, but it's the most obvious one, to give of your finances, to the Lord. That comes very difficult when things are tight. How am I going to make do? Where's this money going to come from? Well, God encouraged his people to obey him, and he would provide. The harvest that they reap in the 6th year would be enough to carry them through. And, sometimes it's just a matter of, I'm just going to do what God says. When he calls me to forgive, when he calls me to tithe, or when he calls me to do something which doesn't make sense in my eyes. But what we find is, even though this is, oh, Lord, I'm just going to have to do this to you, we actually find that it's also for us. And that's a phrase that's repeated in what we've read so far. So, for example, let me find you one. So in verse 4 of chapter 25, this will be a Sabbath to the Lord. But then go down to verse 6, for example. The Sabbath of the land shall provide food for you. Things which seem like, I've got to grit my teeth and do this for the Lord, actually work out for our good. And it's the centenary of Eric Liddell's world record-breaking race, isn't it? At the Paris Olympics, 1924. And he, in his conviction, felt that he couldn't race those heats or whatever they were for the 100-meter sprint because they happened on a Sunday. And so, to the Lord, he didn't race. But he actually found out that it was for him, didn't he? Because in God's grace, he allowed him to run at least the 400, maybe the 200 as well, and break world records. And from there, have such a platform to share the gospel. He did it to the Lord, but it worked out for him. Let me encourage you with that. Something else happened in this year of Jubilee. It was a time of restoration of lands. We've touched on it already. But in verse 12 to verse 17, we read this. This shall be a year, it is a Jubilee, it shall be holy to you, you may eat the produce of the field. In this year of Jubilee, verse 13, each of you shall return to his property. If you make a sale to your neighbor or buy from your neighbor, you shall not wrong one another. You shall pay your neighbor according to the number of years after the Jubilee, and he shall sell to you according to the number of years for crops. If the years are many, you shall increase the price, and if the years are few, you shall reduce the price. For it is the number of the crops that he is selling to you. You shall not wrong one another, but you shall fear your God, for I am the Lord your God. Let me just explain this. Say I've got some land, and I've run on difficult times, so I'm going to sell my land to the wealthy real estate agent, Hannah Bourne. No, not Hannah Bourne, Hannah Wright, excuse me. And I say to Hannah, right, you can have my prime land, and I'll sell it to you for 10,000 shekels. Now, realistically, you can only get, say, 500 shekels worth of food per year from my land. But I'm going to sell it to Hannah for 10,000. Well, if the year of Jubilee is happening next year, is that a good deal? No, because it's got to come right back to me. And the principle was, if you're selling land, you have to sell it in accord with how long that person can own it, because what happens at Jubilee? It comes back to you. Whether you can afford to buy that land back or not, doesn't matter, because in God's grace, it comes back to you. You have a debt, but it doesn't matter. It'll be cancelled and come back to you. And the principle behind it was this. The land wasn't really belonging as such to God's people, was it? The land was the Lord's. And he, if you like, sublet it to his people. Now, we did make promises to them, even unconditional promises, that the land would belong to them, but in regards to a sublet. And that's why the people should be just and fair in the sales that they make, because the land belonged to God. And the same principle is true for us, isn't it? We are stewards of what God has given us. God has given you health. God has given you time. God has given you finances, property, maybe. But they're given from God, aren't they? And we're called to be stewards of the things that we have. Not to hoard or to be greedy, but to use what we have fairly and generously. We read on from verse 23, this: "The land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. For you are strangers and sojourners with me. And in all the country you possess, you shall allow a redemption of the land." If your brother becomes poor and sells part of his property, then his nearest redeemer shall come and redeem what his brother has sold. If a man has no one to redeem it, and then sells himself, and then himself becomes prosperous and finds sufficient means to redeem it, let him calculate the years since he sold it and pay back the balance to the man to whom he sold it, and then return to his property. But if he does not have sufficient means to recover it, then what he sold shall remain in the hand of the buyer until the year of Jubilee. In the Jubilee it shall be released, and he shall return to his property. If a man sells a dwelling house in a walled city, he may redeem it within a year of sale. For a full year he shall have the right of redemption. If it's not redeemed within a full year, then the house in the walled city shall belong in perpetuity to the buyer throughout his generations. It shall not be released in the Jubilee. But the houses of the villages that have no wall round them shall be classified with the fields of the land. They may be redeemed, and they shall be released in the Jubilee. As for the cities of the Levites, that's a priestly tribe, they may redeem at any time the houses and the cities they possess. And if one of the Levites exercises his right of redemption, then the house that was sold in a city they possess shall be released in the Jubilee. For the houses and the cities of the Levites are their possession among the people of Israel. But the fields of pasture land belonging to their cities may not be sold, for that is their possession forever. Whether you could afford to buy it back, well, if you could buy the land back. The person who bought it had no right to say, well, tough, you can't buy it. They had to sell it back to you at a just price. And even if you could not afford to buy it back, what happened at Jubilee? It was restored to your family. Think about the justice and goodness of God in this. We live in a world where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, don't we? But if every 50 years, that house that you sold, maybe for, 100 grand, and you had to pay most of it to clear your debts, well, that got restored back to you, that would prevent the rich accumulating more and more and more land and the poor getting squidged more and more and more to one side. This is the justice of God. How wonderful. Ancient Israel, but God set this up in an equitable way. And I just love that. We're in some of the what people think are the dry parts of the Bible, but we see the goodness and the wisdom of God. There's something else, though, which we want to see ties in with Jubilee, and it's from verse 35 to the end of the chapter. If your brother becomes poor and cannot maintain himself with you, you shall support him as though he were a stranger and a sojourner, and he shall live with you. Take no interest from him or profit, but fear your God, that your brother may live beside you. You shall not lend him your money at interest, nor give him your food for profit. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God. Friends, if people who were living under the law were commanded to show such kindness, how much more should we? Verse 39, if your brother becomes poor beside you and sells himself to you, which will be done, you say, I might owe you 50 grand and I can't pay you, but I'll be your servant. That was a way of dealing with debt. You shall not make him serve as a slave. He shall be with you as a hired worker and as a sojourner, a temporary resident. He shall serve with you until the year of Jubilee. Then he shall go out from you, he and his children with him, and go back to his own clan and return to the possession of his fathers. For they are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves. You shall not rule over him ruthlessly, but shall fear your God. As for your male and female slaves whom you may have, you may buy male and female slaves from among the nations that are around you. You may also buy from among the strangers who sojourn with you and the clans that are with you, who have been born in your land, and they may be your property. You may bequeath them to your sons after you to inherit as a possession forever. You may make slaves of them, but over your brothers, the people of Israel, you shall not rule one over another ruthlessly. Again, the principle was this. If you owed a debt and you've had to sell yourself to be somebody's servant, then even if you couldn't afford to clear the debt, what happened at Jubilee? Your debt was cancelled. Now, we will touch on a topic briefly, which is a difficult one, and it's important because we talk about it in society, a topic of slavery in the Bible, because we've read some things about it there. Jewish people were not permitted to make slaves one of another, but they were permitted to make slaves of those of other nations, and that's a difficult thing. It's troubling to some people. But nowhere in the Bible is slavery described as God's ideal. And we can make a correlation, and I don't say this to hurt someone's feelings who may have gone through it, but we can make a correlation with divorce. Divorce is not God's ideal, is it? But God, through Moses, set parameters and, what's the word that I want to think of? Regulations around divorce. God's ideal was marriage, one man, one woman, for life. But knowing that we live in a broken world, and knowing that that problem will be there, God said, look, if this is going to happen, then make sure you care for this person, etc., etc. And the same is true of slavery. It's a fallen world, and so if there's going to be slaves, you have to care for them. In fact, the slaves were to be looked after as members of the family. Yes, they might be there sort of perpetually unless they could buy their freedom, but they were to be cared for. And particularly Jewish servants, for example, they would be released every 7 years and at the Jubilee. Another problem that people have about slavery in the Bible, and it is a big topic, is this, that neither Jesus nor the Apostle Paul outrightly condemn it. You won't find that. The world in which they lived had about 60 million slaves in the Roman Empire. There might have been more slaves than free men in the Roman Empire. But although they never outrightly condemned the practice, the message that they preached was such that it transformed individuals that would then transform societies. And those principles, which are also found in the Old Testament, that all people are made in the image of God, no matter their ethnicity, set the framework and the groundwork for the abolition of slavery, for example, in our country. And that's the way that God works often, isn't it? Slowly, through individuals, through obeying his word. And some of those great reformers in our times have been Christian men and women. So it's not an easy topic, but I hope that's helpful for us. Let's read on to the end of the chapter, verse 47. If a stranger or sojourner with you becomes rich, so, somebody who's not ethnically Jewish, and your brother beside him becomes poor and sells himself to the stranger or sojourner with you, or to a member of the stranger's clan, then after he is sold, he may be redeemed. One of his brothers may redeem him, or his uncle or his cousin may redeem him, or a close relative from his clan may redeem him. Or if he grows rich, because even slaves could make money if he becomes rich, which is different to chattel slavery that we're familiar with, then he may redeem himself. Verse 50, he shall calculate with his buyer from the year when he was sold until the year of Jubilee, and the price of his sale shall vary with the number of years. Like the land that I've sold to Hannah, the amount of time left would vary how much a person had to pay to buy their freedom from their master. Verse 51, if there are still many years left, he shall pay proportionally for his redemption some of his sale price. If there remain but a few years until the year of Jubilee, he shall calculate and pay for his redemption in proportion to his year of service. He shall treat him as a worker hired year by year, and shall not rule ruthlessly over him in your sight. And if he's not redeemed by these means, then he and his children with him shall be released in the year of Jubilee. For it is to me that the people of Israel are servants. They are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. How often did the year of Jubilee happen? Every 50 years. And that meant that for most people, that would be a once-in-a-lifetime thing. Unless you were kind of a toddler and you had a year of Jubilee and then you had one in your 50s, realistically, you'd see it once in your lifetime. How much would you be looking forward to the year of Jubilee? You would, wouldn't you? My debt's cancelled, returning to my land, equity restored. But you know what? There's evidence in the Bible that God's people never kept the Sabbath years and never kept the year of Jubilee. It's like, and I know I mentioned this before, but with Narnia, it's always winter and it's never Christmas. How they would long for the year of Jubilee to come. Oh, when they saw the rich getting richer, the poor getting poorer, when they were getting more and more estranged from their family, how they would long for it, and it never came. But the reading that Joanne brought for us this morning was read about 1,400 years later from what we're reading this morning by a certain itinerant rabbi. And he read it in his hometown. And he read it in Luke chapter 4. The very first publicly that we have recorded, public sermon of Jesus in a synagogue, he read from Isaiah 61. And I'm going to read it to you. Luke chapter 4. Jesus went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, and he stood up to read. The scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him, and he unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, what Joanne read for us, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives." Does that sound familiar? That's the year of Jubilee. The recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. That was a Jewish way of saying the year of Jubilee. And then Jesus rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down, and the eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him, and he began to say to them, "Today, this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." Jesus saw himself, what he would do, the life that he would bring, as fulfilling the year of Jubilee. I wonder if you've ever been somewhere where they've got a UV lamp, like at a disco or something, or the bowling alley. And a UV lamp shines, and then you suddenly notice, oh, I've got this pattern down my trousers, or there's this embroidery on my shirt. We're going to shine the UV lamp of the year of Jubilee on the ministry of Jesus and see it everywhere. Think about redemption. If you got a debt that you could not pay, what happened at Jubilee? It'd be cancelled. If you were estranged from your family because you had to sell your lands, well, what would happen at the year of Jubilee? You'd be restored to your family and your clan. Think about freedom. Slaves were set free, weren't they? Those Jewish slaves in the covenant family of God were set free at the year of Jubilee. And we read in Galatians 5 that it is for freedom that Jesus has set us free. You know, we live often in slavery to particular sins, in slavery to the fear of death. But Jesus came to set us free from that. You could have had a kinsman redeemer, your brother, your uncle, someone who would pay a price to buy you back, even if you couldn't pay it. We read in Leviticus 25. We owed a debt we could not pay. Jesus paid a debt he did not owe. To ransom us, to redeem us. Jubilee. Brought back to God, brought into the family of God. We know forgiveness. And that word release that we read in Leviticus is the same word when translated into Greek as the word forgive. And Jesus calls us to release debts on others, doesn't he? As we forgive them. We are to be a Jubilee people. Think about the early church, how they had all things in common. They weren't hoarders, were they? And when Jesus returns, earth will have its Jubilee. Jesus saves, Jesus saves. That's what we sang. Isaiah 61 is a millennial passage. It talks about the restoration of God's people and prosperity and peace and justice being brought by Jesus. Romans 8 says this, that creation is a slave. It's under bondage, and it waits for the revealing of the sons of God, which happens when? At Christ's return, Jubilee. Just see how all the Jesus ministry was finding its root, and Jubilee was finding its flowering through Christ. I think it's amazing. And maybe when you're next reading through the Bible, you'll look up for some of those notes of where Jubilee is fulfilled in Christ. As we wrap up, I want to remind us of some things that we've learned. God is a God of justice. And he inspires us to be people of justice. God is the one to whom the land belongs and to whom our possessions really belong. And he calls us to use them, not to hoard, but in a just way, in a generous way. And I want us to think about ourselves. Who are we in this passage? We are ones who, through trust in Jesus, will be restored into his family in glory. We are debtors, a sin debt, who've been redeemed by Jesus. We are servants of God, brought out of slavery to the world and sinful patterns that we can't escape from, and made God's slaves, God's servants. And I'm going to just lead us in prayer now as we respond to what we've heard. Father, we do live in a world that is broken. We think about that song. Do we feel the world is broken? We do. Do we feel the darkness deepen? We do. But Lord, we thank you that you're a God of justice. And we sang in Immortal and Visible that your justice is like mountains high soaring above. Father, As we think about the events in our country this week, we long for justice.